What's good, YouTube? Back again, NOIR on Air with a video for today. We have a special guest today.
Yep.
You know, why don't you introduce yourself and tell our audience who you are. What do you do, and where you come from.
I'm Ronald Taylor. I'm from St. Albans, Queens. I am an educator and administrator in independent education.
Yes, Black educator.
Yeah. And,
This is episode number 7 of NOIR on Air. Like he said, this is our special guest today. Once again, we are in Black History Month, so we're highlighting Black excellence. We just want you guys to make sure you like, comment, subscribe. And just another reminder, we have that Black History Month poetry contest. How old are you?
27.
27 years old. Okay. So can you just explain to us your day-to-day job, what you do there, what your responsibilities are and such?
Yeah, so I currently serve as a diversity director at a New York City-based independent school that services about 1,800 young people. A typical day is typically running programs and setting strategies. So because of the summer of 2020, a lot of independent schools have had to ask the question, how do we actually prove that we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion? My job is to loop data to hold systems and people accountable. Working with faculty in particular, looking at their curriculum and pedagogy. Because what we see in education is that most bias and racist structures are embedded in teaching practice or in school policy. It's fun because I get to really work and coach with people, but it's also challenging because some folks might be immune to changing. Kids are usually always in my office, ranging for different things. It might be, did you hear about what this teacher said? I have a small group of Black kids that always come in every last period on Mondays and Tuesdays, and they call it their tea session. They just tell me who's doing something. So it's one of those usually.
What kind of demographic are we looking at?
Yeah, so faculty-wise, we're majority white. On the student side, we are 45% students of color. Within that, we are about 7% African American, 3% Hispanic or Latinx, and the majority of our student of color population is driven by Southeast Asian or Asian populations. This year, I think the focus on Black students has been super intentional, of course, because of this past summer, but also because that 7% numbers remained the same for the last 14 years.
Okay.
So there hasn't been a significant uptick.
So where did you get this education, and where did it accumulate, and how are you projected and spreading that education?
It's a deep question. As far as my educational journey, I got my Bachelor of Arts degree from Syracuse University in political science and policy with a concentration in African American studies and Black male development. And then from there, I went to, I did a fellowship for graduate school to get my first master's, which was a MS or Master of Science in Education for history education, grades 7 through 12.
Okay.
So I got a New York State credential to teach, as well as a credential in educating all students, which just means thinking about inclusive classrooms.
Would you say you knew that you were going to be an educator right off the bat, or did you have something pushing you toward it?
No, I did not always want to be a teacher. Growing up, I think it was medicine at one point. And I think that what I knew about myself when I was younger was that I liked to help people, I liked to advocate for people, and I liked to be able to inform systems. I think that is what I cared about. And so what I thought about growing up was medicine was not an easier, but a direct way to do that.
Hands-on.
It was hands-on, you have direct impacts, but teaching less. So I think about even growing up, my grandmother used to run a daycare in her house, and I would always have the kids going to class in the basement and running stuff like that. And I made the decision junior year of college.
Undergrad?
Undergrad to formally going to teach. So I taught in New York City for a semester for an externship where I was teaching for my policy degree, and I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. And I went to South Africa and taught in the Eastern Cape, which is the economically hard-hit section of the country. And it just taught me a lot about myself. So I came back after my junior year and enrolled in the fellowship program that I mentioned earlier and got my MSA. And best decision I made because I think that teaching doesn't get a good rep in this country because typically it's seen as a non-important thing.
Do you have a timeout for your camera screen? Because the screen went blank for me, and then I had to push the camera back on.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility for the Black and brown kids that you have somewhat sense of control over? Like, do you feel that if they fall off the wayside, that's on you? How does that work with your psyche?
I think that I do have a sense of responsibility. I mean, just by merit of being a Black male educator in particular, of which we only make up 2% of this nation's teaching force. Like the unicorn, we call it the unicorn effect of being a Black male educator or a Black male school leader at that rate. You do feel a sense of indebtedness to the young people that you work with, especially the Black children. I know statistically, like, I might be their only Black teacher, or depending on how their school journey goes. We have to acknowledge, like, to be a history teacher, and go back to the 1950s when Brown v. Board passed. The biggest failure of Brown is that you put a bunch of Black kids into white schools that did not want them, and then you did not bring the Black teaching force with it. Most of the Black teaching force in this country is basically decimated. We lost about 200,000 African American teachers in the 30 years after Brown. You have to remember that many of the school systems in which they're being educated were not created to actually give them an asset-based, positive experience. I feel my job is twofold. It's to name that in front of my white colleagues,
Call it out.
to make sure that they know where they have to enhance their practice. But it's also, when I'm in front of white children, to make sure they understand that they are benefiting from a system that was physically designed for them to feel good and for others to feel less.
And that really brings me into my next question. You kind of started already for me. How do you teach? Are you comfortable teaching white kids about white privilege? Because this, in the time we're in right now, it's really come to the forefront that white privilege is very much a thing. So how do you teach a class that may have half white kids, half Black kids, half Spanish kids? How do you teach them about that?
I think there's a term called white fragility. The minute when you start naming whiteness directly, there's this feeling like, well, I'm not racist, or I worked hard, or my family are immigrants, so we struggle too, and all these things to kind of cop out and say what they can and can't do. So what I typically frame everything as is thinking about just systems of power, which is, I've always done that when I teach. So when we think about, I'll make it simple. Let's just think about education, right? Or I'll actually use housing to take it out of education, right? So it's really hard to deny that there's white supremacy and racism when we just look at federal documents. So, for example, the town where I grew up, Hempstead, New York, is a part of a series of towns that were called the Black Belt, which were redlined in the 1950s because the amount of Black families moving into them. The families living in Hempstead, Baldwin, Roosevelt, Freeport were given mortgages at rates like a 40-year mortgage at 6%, but literally if you go north into Garden City or south into Rockville Center, you never saw those mortgage offerings. So the amount of debt that the Black families hold in Hempstead, for example, is far greater than the families that have a house 3 times the value in a Garden City.
Gotcha.
That is a policy. If I literally go into the federal housing records, I can see a map that says this neighborhood is redlined because of things like colored people living there. And then Garden City, for example, might be in a green or a blue zone. It's a developing and up and coming. So it's really difficult for a white person to say that that is not racism, because I can say, let's just look at the standard of housing. What was the differentiating factor? It was race. We can take it as far back as the 1700s, because people love to always say, well, there's no data to prove that. Carl Linnaeus, one of the famous botanists that developed the way we classify organisms, like genus and species. So like we're called Homo sapiens because of his classification system. He took that same system and classified the races. And so like he listed the Europeanists, or like that's how he said Europeans, and classified it down to Black folks. And if you look at his dichotomy, it was like European is smart, able, understands order and structure in government. But if you go down to the African American or the Black description in that same structure, he says things like lazy, confrontational, women are only good for their breeding. That was the only classification where he directly acknowledged that woman, so that attack on Black women. So it's hard for white people to argue with historical fact. And so that's how I usually teach it.
You just went through
A lot
almost
in 30
like
seconds.
400 years of
very
just
impressive.
disparity. But how do you bring that 400 years into maybe one semester of teaching, one semester of learning?
The difficulty is, right, like this can't be confined into one, semester, right? That's why, like, when I'm thinking about curriculum, in 6th grade, my kids might just learn about Carl Linnaeus, right? But in 7th grade, they'll learn about housing policy. And, it's like you have to think about how do you loop in a consistent arc across the disciplines. But the easiest way is that kids understand what's fair and what's not fair. So literally, I could take out all the racial identifiers of my housing example. I can just say, look at the way these neighborhoods are described. Is this a fair way to give people housing? I think for every $100 a white family has in wealth, a black family has $8 in wealth, literally because of the housing market in the 1950s.
All right, so being an educator, and obviously past year we had COVID, COVID-19, it changed pretty much everything. I had an opportunity to tutor a young girl in a math class, and it seemed like she was a smart student, but it seemed like the technology, the Zoom classes, all that kind of hindered her to. Can you talk about like advantages, maybe disadvantages of COVID?
What COVID did was it just gaslighted all the inequities we knew that already existed in education. If my school did not have a one-to-one technology policy, when we did the shift to remote learning, one of the biggest barriers for most schools was, okay, how do kids gonna learn remote if a child does not have access to a computer? Or do I actually have space in my home to learn productively? Or am I in a household where there's like 5 other kids and we all share the same room to do work, right? Vast inequities, and I'm hoping that it raises questions around school district funding. How do we even look at if we have to live through more public health crises in the future? How do we have those plans already set into place? Because it's not like a pandemic was a surprise. President Obama, I think it was in 2018, had a task force saying we're going to deal with a pandemic again. These are not atypical circumstances. So how do we actually do these types of things? But that wing of the federal government was removed with the Trump administration, and then we had the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think ultimately a lot of what we have to think about is how is this moment teaching us what's actually important to teach? How do we educate young people in moments of crisis? What's the actual goal of education? A lot of schools are thinking like, why do we even give grades now? Like, why are we assessing kids in a grade system in a pandemic? You're going to have your optimal learning moment behind a Zoom screen, or when you're flip-flopping between remote and in-person instruction.
Like you said, there's so many developmental aspects that children go through at these certain times. It's like being with all these things that's going on. How do you, just like you said, how do you really determine whether they're doing well or not? How do you give them a grade based on that? How do you, because each child is going to be different. Each child is going to react to a situation different. One child might flourish under the Zoom era, and the other might need that extra help. That's the student that's going to wait after class, is going to get that extra help because they need it.
What are you actually assessing by giving a grade? Are you assessing how well a child knows how to run a derivative, or are you assessing how well a child can persist through a mental health, racial reckoning, pandemic crisis?
You told me some really, really, really interesting, inspiring news yesterday. How about you tell them what's going on with your life right now?
So on July 1st, I will be the next middle school head of the Browning School, which is a K-12. Thank you.
So to the layman person like myself, what does that really mean? What does that really entail?
So a division head is the same as a principal, as you would hear in the public school system. The biggest thing that's different is a lot of these institutions that are private schools in the New York City market, it depends on where you are in the country, historically were not built for Black folks. The school that I'll be transitioning to, like most independent schools, didn't start taking Black students until the 1970s. I'm excited because I will be the first African American principal for the middle school. It's an all-boys school. It serves grades K through 12, about 400 students, 135 in the middle school, and it was founded in 1888.
So how do you feel it'll be accepted from not only the faculty, but maybe the parents of the students?
I would not have taken the job if I didn't sense that the community was ready to be led by a Black millennial in particular. I'm not 40, I'm 27. Right? Staff was energized by a lot of what I was saying. Like a lot of the work that I plan on doing on a curricular standpoint is just asking what are the windows that we give young people. So what experiences are they learning about, and what are the mirrors? So how do they see themselves reflected in the curriculum? Because in the middle school context, it's really not about the things you learn, it's about the identity that you form, and that should be informed by curriculum. As far as the parents, I think parents in the private school market are always they're either your greatest asset or your biggest enemy. Your goal is to make them always your biggest asset. And so during the parent portion of my interview process, a lot of what I was doing was like firing back questions around like, why would you all not be ready to engage in racial literacy given the time that we're living in? We're a pandemic who is not racist acts as though it is, because it disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx folks. But what really got me to commit to the school was the head of school, which is like the person who runs the whole organization, who is a younger head of school and is committed to a lot of the change effort. So that's what excites me about it. It's not going to be easy at all. I mean, institutions are always difficult, but I'm excited by the opportunity just to redirect generational wealth, especially in an educational setting, to do more important work.
So I want you to finish this statement.
Oh dear.
I, Ronald Taylor, will be remembered for
Being intentional. People don't always remember what you say, but they remember how you make them feel. And so ultimately, that's what I think is more important. Research to show those are the kids that actually learn. The kids that feel disenchanted in the classroom space tend to underperform.
So yes, this was a great interview with Ronald Taylor.
Thank you for
we
coming.
really enjoyed you. You know, definitely spitting some real facts about the education system.
And I'm sure you'll be back, right?
Yeah,
Of course.
Anytime.
Of course.
Anytime. I'll talk to my agent.
Yeah, we just gotta write him a little
Right.
check.
Let me write that down real quick.
But for real, this is our opportunity to really show people that the reason why we have him here is to show people that what you set out to do in life is possible. You know what I'm saying? And especially if you have people that look like you, that's why it's Black History Month. You want to exemplify a African American person who's doing great things. All right, so we got coffee or tea,
Tea.
ketchup or mustard.
Mustard.
All right, I got on a hot dog or so. What do you put on a hot dog? Mustard.
Mustard.
Mustard on a hot dog.
Yeah.
Mustard on a hot dog.
Yes.
I very much very love enjoy. No, mustard.
And I bet y'all use relish too, right?
Yeah. I like onions.
Onion.
Little sazon.
Oh my god.
Sauerkraut.
Oh, all right, please. Oh man. New York City or Atlanta?
It's really hard. It's really hard.
Let's go.
Professionally, New York. Everything else, Atlanta.
One Netflix show you're binging at the moment.
Bridgerton just started that too.
Oh, that's
yesterday.
good. That's good. That's
It's
really
great.
good.
It's quality television.
Yeah.
You need to watch it.
Yeah, the women like that show.
Absolutely.
So, listen, if you watch the show, you'll know why I just said that. All right, so alcohol, do you prefer it dark or do you prefer it light?
Light.
Light, so like tequila.
Tequila.
A cardigan or a blazer?
Cardigan.
Okay, so you're on a island. One item to bring during this apocalyptic island. What weapon are you bringing?
A machete.
Oh, she like up close and personal. I'm bringing a gun. I'm sorry.
I mean, guns and gun. Deadlock, they jam,
You're
machete.
not bringing a gun?
It's multifaceted. You can do a lot
Okay,
with that.
machete. You could chop up stuff.
Chop
you could
up
make a
stuff.
little house. Okay, I get you.
It's real swift.
Just one weapon. I'm bringing a multi-tool.
A multi-tool?
Yeah.
You thought deeper into it.
You sound like the white.
You thought
That's what you
deeper
would
into
do.
it.
Always prepared. Come on.
I'm thinking about survival.
One past failure or mistake that has led to your success.
Ever since that first week teaching, that's why I approach my practice the way that I do. Because it was bad because I was underprepared.
So now you're always prepared.
I'm always over prepared, and I think that's what made my career what it is now. That feeling that that anxiety you get when you screw something up. I seldom want to ever have that experience again.
But that is a great episode once again. My name is Malik,
My name is Jason. Thank you for tuning in, and we are out.
and that's a wrap.
I'll have my